I'm very pleased to have had a chance to do this. It gave me the opportunity to go back through about 1,000 slides and sort of relive the past 23 years of working in New Mexico, looking at all the people get gradually older, including myself, and seeing all the stuff that we've done. It's been actually really a pleasure to sort of, it probably took me much longer to prepare this talk than it should have, because I kept looking at all these pictures and I would get distracted and so on. It's been a really great time working here. I'm currently at the home of my colleague Spencer Lucas and his wife Yami Lucas, who have been gracious enough to let me use their internet this evening. My hotel has kind of a bulky internet, and so it's great to be here. And you'll see some pictures with Spencer as we go through here. He's really been the engine of our field work and collecting out here, and our work out of the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science. So my work has been in the Paleozoic for a long time. I started that with graduate school and began really getting interested from the beginning and more in paleoecology than in the systematic part of paleobotany. But it's absolutely certain that you've got to know what you're talking about with the plants before you can do anything with them numerically. So you're always forced to stay involved with what is this stuff. And I'll come back to this later if I remember to bring it up later. But the Paleozoic is much less diverse than today. Maybe the Paleozoic tropics. We'll be talking about the tropical realm, and it may be 10 to 100 times less diverse. So, you know, if you go into the modern tropics, you can find easily 100 species of trees on a hectare. You probably won't find 100 species of trees in the entire Pennsylvanian. So it's a really different world, and it means the dynamics of that world are really very different. So you're going to have a different niche breadths, different colonization strategies. Everything's different because of the much lower diversity world. And most of the plants are either wind pollinated or wind dispersed or both. And those that aren't have much shorter species ranges. There's a group called seed ferns, which I'll show you. They turn over faster. They have very big seeds and very big pollen grains. But everybody else, being wind dispersed or wind pollinated, has very long species ranges, very large biogeographies. So it's a different world, and it really makes you assess the basic rules of how ecosystems work, including the relationship between stability and diversity. There are very stable ecosystems in the Paleozoic that have very few species compared to much of the discussions we hear today about biodiversity. So lots of things come up, and you can do a lot with the Paleozoic world when you're looking at today. So can I share my screen? So here we go. All right, so we'll be looking at the world of the late Paleozoic, which is somewhere roughly around 300 million years ago. It's actually, you know, an extended period of some 15 million years or more. Let me change this here to hide self view. And trying to figure out how I change the position of the gallery, but we'll see as we go. So this world is a world in which the continents are arrayed into the major continent of Pangaea, which I'm sure you're all familiar with that name and may know what this looks like. Surrounding this continental mass, where most of them were agglomerated together into one big mass, is what's been called Panthalassa, which is this gigantic ocean around most of the Earth. And all the continents are here except for modern day China, which is over on the side there. Okay, so this is the world. China is this series of microcontinents out here in the east. This is the Tethyan Ocean in between. And what you'll see now in this next slide is that if we go to the current world, the northern and southern continents in Asia have closed up. Tethys is still there. The Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, the Aral Sea. There's a whole series of little string-like lakes here across Asia that are the remains of Tethys, but like a clamshell, those two parts have closed up. And at the same time, North and South America rotated and pushed away, opening the Atlantic Ocean. So that's the changes between then and now over a very long period of time, just to give you some reference frame. New Mexico at this time is way out west in Pangaea, in the Pangaean tropics. And during that time, basically, you all the time have seasonal drought to aridity. So even then, the climate is on the drier end of things, even in the Paleozoic, much like it is today. And the climate of the Paleozoic at times must have been very similar to the present day New Mexico climate. The Pennsylvanian is also an ice age world. It's basically the last ice age world before the one that we're in today. So we're currently in an interglacial, and the Pennsylvanian would have a series of glacials and interglacials, except many, many more of them than we have had so far in our current world. This is a more fanciful reconstruction of Ron Blakey's. You have ice at the southern hemisphere, grounded ice. There have been searches for grounded ice in the northern hemisphere. They've never found any. And again, the basic organization of the continents at that time, just to show you what's going on there. And what's controlling this? I'm just trying to set you up so you understand what kind of world these plant fossils are coming from. If you're at glacial maximum, which we're not now, we're currently in this interglacial. And let's start there, since this is where we are today. And during the interglacial, you have something called the intertropical convergence zone. And you have high pressure cells near the poles. And due to various things, which I'll show you in a minute, that intertropical convergence zone fluctuates back and forth on an annual basis. And you can see from satellite views, maybe some of you have seen these, you can watch the northern hemisphere turn green and the southern hemisphere turn brown, and then you can see it flip around the other way from satellite view. Now, during the glacials, when there's ice at the southern hemisphere and it's cold at the northern hemisphere, the high pressure cells are pushed down. There's something called Hadley cells. Those are the big circulating air masses in the northern and southern hemispheres. And as those Hadley cells are pushed down, the intertropical convergence zone becomes fixed at the equator, and the equator becomes very wet. Where these high pressure cells, these circulating cells collide, you get high levels of rainfall. So here then the interglacial, as they're moving back and forth, you get seasonal drought in the tropical regions. So this would be during high ice periods. This would be during low ice periods on glacial interglacial cycles of about 100,000 years. These are controlled by things called Milankovitch fluctuations or orbital variations, and they're controlled by such things as changes in the shape of the orbit, which happens on about 100,000 year cycle, changes in something called obliquity of the axis, the tilt of the axis, which is on about a 40,000 year cycle, and axial precession, which is the wobble of that axis, which is on about a 26,000 year cycle. The main one of these cycles is this changes in the eccentricity of the orbit, but they all influence the intensity of a glaciation and the relative timings of these things. So the 100,000 year cycle is important to keep in mind, because we'll take a look at that here in a minute. At the same time this is happening with these fluctuations, you're also getting fluctuations in atmospheric carbon dioxide and in sea level. So as ice melts and forms, melts and forms, melts and forms, you'll see sea level fluctuations. So this is a sea level curve. This is high stand over here on the right side, low stand on the left side, and each of these marks a glacial interglacial cycle. So you can see there's a lot of those during the Pennsylvanian period. And although the record is coarser, this is proxy data. This isn't a direct measure, of course, looking at carbon and isotopes and other kinds of plant cuticle material. You can look at stomatal densities and that sort of thing, and estimate carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at the times. And you can see it also fluctuates. So you have a linked system here. As ice advances, you have the Milankovitch fluctuations driving this at the deepest level. That controls the advances and retreats of the ice, which is directly linked to sea level, which is also linked to atmospheric composition. So this whole system is like a clock, all these things operating together. So again, New Mexico's out here in the western part of Pangaea. Most of the studies are focused here on the center part of the Pangaean continent. These are the coal basins in the eastern North America and in Europe. And later on, those coal basins shift over to China. In this part of the world, during the glacials, when you're at glacial maximum, the ice pulls the water off these very flat, large continents, And big peat deposits form on these lowlands, and those turn into coal. During the glacials, the ice, the interglacials, the ice melts, the sea comes up on these big flat continents, and you also get seasonal drought. In New Mexico, remember, it's dry all the time. So when you're at the time of the time of the glacials and the sea level is low, it's going to be seasonal drought. And during the interglacials, it's going to be arid. So you're getting an overall drier climate out here in Western Pangaea. This is what it looks like in the coal basins, where most of the work has been done. Here's a fossil soil. Here's a coal bed. This is part of the terrestrial phase during the glacials. Oop, I didn't mean to switch that, but these are all marine beds here. So these are marine shales, marine limestone, and so this is the phase of the glacial melting and the flooding of the continent. And you can see that one of these things, they're called a cyclothem. These cycles have the glacial phase and an interglacial phase. And these repeat. So here is one cycle right here. This is a coal bed, and there's a fossil soil underneath of it. These are interglacial deposits. These are interglacial deposits. There would have been a coal bed that's buried here on this bench that's been stripped out. There's a coal bed up here on this bench. You can barely see it. So there's another set of interglacials. So you have basically a coal bed down here. There's one beginning of one cycle, interglacial, another cycle, interglacial, another cycle, interglacial, another cycle, interglacial. So this is what it looks like in those wet central parts of Pangaea. And this gives you these classic reconstructions of coal swamps that you see, giant dragonflies, humid environments, and all that sort of thing. But we also know there is something between those coal beds. So when the sea goes up on the continents, it becomes seasonally dry, and you get a very different flora. And the coal flora appears to go into refugia in the central areas. And then when you go back into the glacial again, and the continent is exposed, the vegetation expands back out. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, in New Mexico, it looks entirely different. So this is Socorro County. These arrows are pointing to the interglacials. These are marine limestones. They're they're flooding up onto the craton. And between there are the interglacials. So you can still pick up glacial interglacial cyclicity, but it doesn't look anything like it does in the coal basins. And this is my colleague, Dan Cheney, who worked with me for many years, probably one of the best field geologists I've ever worked with. Great collector, and had contributed greatly to our collections at the museum. And probably in New Mexico, the vegetation looked more like this. This would be when coal is forming in the east. This is what New Mexico might have looked like. You would have wetland vegetation, pretty much the same wetland vegetation that formed a coal swamp in Illinois, let's say, or in West Virginia. But surrounding that would be this completely different vegetation consisting of drought-tolerant plants. So most of the landscape was composed of drought-tolerant plants, and in the wetter spots along lake margins and stream valleys, you would find this wet vegetation. Another reconstruction, that one was, in fact, let me back up there if I can. If you've been to the Dendron Museum, they have a beautiful exhibit of life through time. And I was given a secret on this particular one. The way they've oriented it today, they show the sun, I think, going across this thing. But if you oriented it in the Paleozoic, the sun actually should rise out here in the west. So if you ever go to see the exhibit, you'll know one of the secrets of the misorientation of this particular reconstruction. They had a great artist there, Jan Vriesen. This is one of his reconstructions. Again, the west would have looked something like this. This is from their book, Ancient Denvers. Again, down in the valleys, you've got wetland plants. We'll come back to this little guy here called Sphenophyllum. This is probably Sigillaria. It's a lycopsid tree. And surrounding that, you would have conifers and other kinds of drought-tolerant plants. This is the same time peat is forming in the central part of Pangaea. Okay, quick look. We'll go from the Pennsylvanian to the Permian. I'll take you through each of these. You can visually, instantly see the change. Here's Pennsylvanian rocks. This is, again, Socorro County, something called the Four Hills Draw. And the Permian rocks, red and this yellowish gray here, the Abo and Yeso formations. So you have a real change in depositional style, change in climate lots of changes as you go into the Permian. The Permian, lower parts of the Permian, the Abo Formation look very much like this. Another colleague, John Nelson, who I've worked with extensively out in New Mexico. And we'll come and look at some of the details of what these rocks look like in just a bit. But you can see they immediately look different from the Pennsylvanian. And this is what a Permian landscape may have looked like, composed much more of drought-tolerant plants. These are conifers, corditalians related to the conifers, and a variety of strange and poorly known ground cover vegetation. Okay, so now let's go and look at some plants from New Mexico at this time. We'll begin with the Pennsylvanian, the middle part of the Pennsylvanian. This is one of the most important coal forming times in central Pangaea, in Europe, and in Eastern North America. If you look out in New Mexico, these are going to be mixed assemblages of wetland and drought-tolerant plants, which is going to be very different from what we see in those coal basins. This is a site in Socorro County. It's, again, middle Pennsylvanian age. This gives you sort of a broad view of what it looks like over here in the lower right. This is in the lower part of that. This is blown up in this section. It was being mined around the turn of the 18 to 1900s for claystone mined for bricks. And there probably is a coaly streak in there someplace. And plant fossils were found in this shaly material below that claystone, which is a fossil soil. So one of the reasons that it's good for brick making is that a lot of the minerals and things have been leached out of it, leaving it a kaolinitic soil, which is useful for brick making. The predominant plant that we find in there is something called an arborescent lycopsid. And these giant trees are sort of hallmarks of the Pennsylvanian period. One of the common forms is lepidodendron. That's the name for the stem. Stigmaria, shown over here, these little dots where rootlets were attached, long leaf-like rootlets. You can see them in this reconstruction. That's the root system. These root systems were very flat. They didn't penetrate very deeply into the soil. They may have gone out and created maybe a 10-meter platform around the base of this tree, giving it a very stable position and a soft substrate. These are leaf bases of lepidodendron. This little scar right here, there, or there is where the leaf was actually attached. And these particular species were deciduous. And this often gives it the name snake plant. You can see how miners will often say they were finding snakes in the roof when they found pieces of branches of these plants. Now, other things that are there are typical wetland plants also. This is a pinnule of something called Neuropterus, which is a seed fern. I'll explain all these in just a minute. And this is a calamitalian. You can see the internode construction. This is related closely to modern horsetails or equisetum. And mixed with these, we find these inarticulate brachiopods, Lingula. Lingula, you may know, has changed very little since the Paleozoic. The basic form of the animal is the same, and they like brackish water environments. So we're probably dealing with a lagoon or some kind of a thing like that. So to give you some background on the vegetation, I one time asked my colleague, Scott Elric, who you'll see later on, if he would, I thought, Scott, a really good idea for a party is have a button that says, ask me about, and you can put whatever you want underneath of it. And I thought, I need a button that says, ask me about lepidodendron, since I did my PhD thesis on it. So Scott made me a button. And just to emphasize the point about lepidodendron, it's upside down on this button. So if I were wearing it, and anybody actually knew anything about lepidodendron, they would think that I didn't. So it's a great object for that purpose. This is some of the lepidodendron trees. We don't know a great deal about them, despite them being very common and studied for almost 200 years. Developmentally, the current model is that they probably started as a mound-like plant. The root systems developed. There is a great possibility that these rootlets, which were born on the root systems, they're not positively geotropic. They go out 360 degrees around this root system where these little scars are and are shown. And they may have been photosynthetic if they were popping up in the air, because they're here's a cross section of one of the stems. If you know plant anatomy, this is about the size of a $50. This is the water conducting tissue. That's the primary body right there in the middle. This is the secondary xylem. We're at the base of the tree. This is the bark. These trees were probably bark supported, not wood supported. The wood physiological studies on this wood, doing sort of mathematical numerical studies, suggest that it could transport water at a very high rate. So very efficient water conducting, but it provided no support for the plant. The support mainly came from a thick rind of bark. How do you get to this, though, was the question. That's the primary body shows you how tiny the early plant, the juvenile plant was. And you get trees that are 150 feet tall and are 2 meters around at the base. We don't understand exactly how you reach these growth morphologies from the juveniles. So maybe the root system established itself first. It was photosynthetic itself. It did not penetrate deeply in the soil. And then this trunk began to elongate at some point after the tree had established itself. There's evidence that the apical meristem was massive, so it may have developed much like a palm. And there are two growth forms. One form grew without branching until at some point branching was triggered and all the reproductive organs were produced in the crown. So it's functionally monocarpic. It reproduces once during a very short period of time. The rest of these guys produce deciduous lateral branch systems. So they continuously produce branches as they developed. And the reproductive organs were born in these lateral branches, which were shed once the cones had matured. Some of the other groups that are present, this is a tree fern, this is a Moradiellian tree fern. They are still with us today. They're not trees, they're basically mound-like growth forms. The cross-section of this tree, Ceronius it's called, had no secondary xylem, but it was surrounded by a thick mantle of roots. Those were the roots that were surrounding this tree. And you can see the mantle here. So this is a different way to build a tree. This one is small primary body with this large adventitious root mantle surrounding it. The Sphenopsids, modern Equisetum, the fossil Calamites, a longitudinal section of one of these Calamitalian stems showing you the nodes where everything would have been organized in this node-internode construction. They're probably different families. The reproductive organs are organized differently in the modern Equisetalis than they are in these Calamitales. But they're still very closely related and they're architecturally very similar. These are woody, whereas modern Equisetalis are not. Then there's the sister group of the modern conifers. This is the Corditales. Here's a modern conifer just to make the point that this is the most closely related modern group. They were woody. This is a cross-section of one of their stems. They had a very large pith, unlike the conifers today do. And that pith was septate, had little layers of tissue that were crossing it. So you could have burned these in your fireplace or built a house out of logs, Corditalian logs, very dense, what's called pycnoxylic wood. And I like to consider these the oaks of the Paleozoic. They grew all the way from coastal environments like this mangrove reconstruction here to being big upland trees of very great size, several meters up in diameter and 100 more feet tall. They could be really big things. And finally, there are the seed ferns, still yet another way to build a tree. This is Medulosa. The leaves are the main organ of the plant. Some of the leaves of the Medulosa and seed ferns could get up to 7 meters in length. Think of a nipa palm for the size of some of the fronds. They bore seeds, and they were called seed ferns because they initially were thought to be ferns. They had these compound leaves, and then around 1900, Oliver and Scott in Britain were able to make links to seeds and hook up this whole family, basically create awareness of this new group of plants. Their closest living relatives are probably the cycads. They're not very close, but they're probably the closest of the living forms. They were ancestrally vines. This is a cross-section through a single stem. The primary bodies are going to be primary xylem there, and in between. And those primary bodies are completely surrounded, the primary xylem strands are completely surrounded by wood. So this is not atypical of vines. It gives the vine flexibility. And these guys basically had to overcome this architecture to become trees. Okay, so those are the players. in this Pennsylvanian flora, the wetland players. This is the Kinney Quarry from southeast of Albuquerque. This is one of the inactive pits. And you can see this is the high wall here. Most of the plant fossils in here come from the lower part of this quarry in deposits that look like this. These are tidalites. They're probably forming in some kind of a lagoon. And a couple of recent publications on this. This is a flora that I did with a few other people, and a volume that the entire Kinney Quarry that Spencer Lucas and others edited just recently. And if you're interested in these, the New Mexico Museum bulletins are free to you online. And you just log on to the New Mexico Museum site and you'll be able to download any of these publications. So that's a look at the quarry. It is a mixed flora, so it will consist of wetland plants, a lot like you see here. These are all sphenopsids. This is annularia. You can see the organization of these elongate leaves. They're single-veined, and they're at the typical node-internode construction. This is Astrophilides. It doesn't show very well, but it also is node-internode, and you can see the difference in the orientation of its leaves. They all tend to point upward, again, all classically single-veined. And this cone is Paleostoic. It doesn't show you very well, but again, you can see these node-internode constructions, and the sporangia are located in these clusters around the central part of that cone. Here is a stem of a calamite, nodes and internodes. So again, the Equisutalian body plan. And a close-up here, these little guys are called microconchids. They're a form of worm that like brackish water environments, and they attach to floating vegetation. So again, if the Kinney Quarry was kind of a lagoon, a lagoonal setting back there in the late Pennsylvanian, you would get these kinds of critters in there. Now we crossed a boundary here because the material I showed you earlier was middle Pennsylvanian. When you went into between the middle and late Pennsylvania, there's a major vegetational change. About 2/3 of the species in wetland environments go extinct, and most of the trees disappear, including the big giant lycopsids. All but one form go away, and they're replaced by a whole suite of new species. And we believe that's probably due to a major single glaciation climate change. We spent a lot of times trying to figure out if we could see this change coming by looking at the fossil record leading up to it. And the plants don't show any change, but there are significant changes in the dynamics of the Earth system up to that point, the intensity and variability in the glaciations. The one lycopsid that survives that extinction is Sigillaria. And it survives perhaps because it has a unique root system. Instead of just spreading out laterally for 10 meters, it also has special roots that plunge down as much as a couple of meters into the substrate. So it could tap into deeper root systems, which would have let it survive during periods of seasonality. It's an interesting plant. It grows unbranched for the most part. Occasionally it will fork in two. It bears its cones directly on the stem. It also shows us an example of growth rhythmicity, probably in relation to seasonal climate variabilities. Notice how close together, these are the leaf scars where leaves would have been attached on this plant, and they're very close together here. They begin to spread out, so the plant's probably growing faster, and then they get really spread out here. And this is very typical of late Pennsylvanian sigillarias. If the cushions will get, if we had more of it, they would get closer together again above this, and then they'd spread out again. So it shows this rhythmicity of growth, and it's probably telling us that there was a seasonal environment. And a reconstruction of what Sigillaria may have looked like. This again is courtesy of Kirk Johnson, and the artist was Jan Vriesen at the Denver Museum at the time. Moradialian tree ferns are also present in abundance at the Kinney Quarry. Again, these are wetland plants. Remember, we have modern Moradiales with us, but they're not trees. And most of them are of this type. Was named after it turns out Pecopterus, which is a name that was commonly used for this, is invalid. The type specimen of Pecopterus isn't a Moradialian fern. So we don't have a substitute name for this yet. And especially if it's not fertile. So people are saying use the names for fertile foliage. Let me, as a quick aside, point out what you may know, that paleobotany uses basically form taxa. the same plant, like that giant lepidodendron tree, the stem is called lepidodendron, the leaf is called Lepidophyloides, spore-producing cone is Lepidostrobus, the female cone that produces a kind of seed-like structure is Lepidocarpon, the roots are Stigmaria, the spores are Lycospora. It's all one plant. So these names for paleobotanists just become second nature, but it can be really confusing for people not used to using all these names for one plant. But this Astrophilides type form is the common form. There is also something in Kinney called Daniites. And if you look at it closely, you can see that this has a lateralness to the side-to-side look to the pinnules. Well, these types have, when they produce their sporangia, they produce them in synangia. They're fused together laterally, and they're circular, those synangia on the bottom. So they would open up, the synangia would open up, there'd be multiple sporangia fused together, and they would release their spores. This is not the modern configuration. Daniites has the modern configuration. The synangia are like a hot dog bun. And when they open up, inside is a row of sporangia, and they release their spores. So this is a very early modern architecture for Braddialian ferns. There are also these seed ferns. This is Allothopteris. This is the one that had 7-meter-long fronds. We usually just get scraps of these, as you see here. And these two are very common seed fern forms through the middle and late Pennsylvania. This is Neuropteris ovata. You can see it's got this very characteristic pinnule that's attached, very narrowly attached, whereas Allothopteris is very broadly attached and has this sort of trailing edge, and tends to hook up to the preceding pinnules. And the veins are very sideways pointing, very has this laterality to it. This has a very narrow attachment point, and it has this sort of auricle at the base of the pinnule. So it's a very recognizable form of pinnule, and Neuropteris ovata is very widespread. This is Macroneuropteris schweitzeri. It has these big pinnules, and its frond is actually rather small, about 1.5 meters in length. And Macroneuropteris schweitzeri is interesting. Let me see. If you look very closely on this, you can see that the venation looks kind of askew in here. There are things that used to be thought to be hairs on the pinnule surfaces. Jean-Pierre Leven in France dissected these and discovered that they're not hairs, they're resin canals that are subepidermal and probably a defense against insect predation. There are also intermediate forms of pteridosperms and other plants. This is Mixonura as a seed fern. It looks much like Macroneuropteris schweitzeri, but if you look at the venation on these guys, the lateral veins don't arc up gracefully. They turn to almost right angles in here. So the venation is different from Macroneuropteris. It doesn't have any of the subepidermal resin canals. This is mixed with brackish water clams called Dunbarella, which occur in great numbers in some of the Kinney beds. This is another seed fern over here called Odontopteris auriculata. Both of these two are found consistently with floras of a dry type nature. And this is Charlia manzanitana. It's what's called a Neger-Athialian. A paper literally just came out recently looking at the anatomy of these plants. These are probably most closely related to progymnosperms. And I'll come back to this in just a moment when I show you what this group of plants looked like. And to throw in some insect interest here, this is the seed fern. This is, again, Mixonura subcrenulata. And you can see in here where insects have gnawed at the margins of these pinnules. You can tell this because the veins are still projecting from the edges of this damage. And it's very dark surrounding the vein areas, which is a recovery. The plant is making a tissue that blocks off the loss of fluids and whatnot from the plant's tissues. And you can see somebody's really gotten at this. Now, what's interesting is insect damage in the Pennsylvanian period is much, much lower than today. If you go out in your backyard, at least in the East, when I go out in my backyard and look at the plants, trees, ground cover, almost every leaf has insect damage on it. Here we're looking at about 1 to 2% of the leaves are insect damaged. And it just raises a real dilemma. I mean, we have insects that can eat the plants. We have the plants. Why is the insect damage so low? And we don't have an answer for that. And my colleague Conrad LaBandera has been making a career out of studying insect damage and has written a gigantic damage guide. And I think that's also available online if you want to go look at his damage types. I think there's a couple hundred of them right now. You can find that online at, I believe, the Museum of Natural History site in Washington. Okay, so we go from those intermediate forms to forms that are absolutely tolerant of seasonal drought. They're xeromorphic in their construction. They include conifers like this one or Nestiodendron. You can clearly see the difference in the leaf architecture or leaf posture between Nestiodendron and Notovisia. Here the leaves are compressed very closely against the stem. Here they have this very broad sweep. This is a plant called Philotheca. It's a sphenopsid, which you can tell by its internode organization, but it's only found in association with these kinds of plants. So we presume that it was tolerant of drought on that basis alone. Again, the brackish water clams. And this is the Corditalian, which I mentioned earlier. This is the close sister taxon of these conifers. Unlike the conifers, the Corditalians had big strap-shaped leaves, and they tended to float in water, and we very frequently find these microconchid worms attached on Corditalian leaves, and Kinney would have been a good place for that. There are also some unusual things at Kinney. This is a plant that we found recently. This was, we had a field trip to the Kinney quarry that Spencer Lucas led, and this plant, which you see on the right side of the screen, was for sale by the collectors relatively inexpensively. And I thought, I'm not going to buy this thing. So we waited and paid like 10 times as much for it in a fossil shop. When I finally dawned on me back in Washington, I should have bought that plant. What was I thinking? It's a whole plant. It's got a growth architecture nobody ever dreamed of. It's got a bulbous stem with these fronds emerging from that stem. We've never seen anything with this kind of growth architecture. The root is preserved. We also have the counterpart, which shows this with lateral roots on it. And the New Mexico Museum has, this is a type specimen of Arnophyton, which is probably a juvenile of this plant. And it also has the base. You can see some of the roots here and some of the young sprout leaves growing out there. This is from their type collection. And here's a paper that just recently appeared on this plant, which is now Sphenopteridium germanicum. The co-author on this one, Hans Kerp, he probably should have been senior author, but he refused to do so. It took him 3 years to work out the taxonomy of this plant group. Pennsylvanian plant taxonomy can be really seriously difficult. And to show you what some of these leaves look like, they tend to be forked. This is actually the type specimen for Sphenopteridium manzanitanum, which turns out to be the type species for this particular plant. And here's one of the very large fronds. This is the hammer of a geological hammerhead here. So these things can get really large, but all attached to these big globose stems. This is the Negarathiales. These are possibly progymnosperms. The progymnosperms were a group that evolved very early in the late Devonian, and probably are the group from which seed plants evolved. They're spore-producing plants, but they have all the rest of their anatomy looks like a seed plant. So they're probably that's why they call them progymnosperms, the pre-gymnospermous groups. They have no living descendants. In a recent paper by the Wang here, Jun Wang, who I'll show you a picture of in a little bit, Jun and his colleagues have now worked out the anatomy of this, and they look like something called Archaeopteris, which was the late Devonian version of the early progymnosperms. This is Charlia manzanitana again. This is the type specimen, which is described by Serge Mamet, so it's in the USNM collections. This is Plagiosomites planchardi, and this is Ioania taeniata. Now, Charlia, you can tell these guys apart. Charlia has this notched tip. It's very characteristic of it. In Plagiosomites, the tip is round and the veins come up to the margin. In Charlia, the veins go all the way to the end. And the same in Ioania, the veins go all the way to the end, but the ends are either truncated or they're scooped. So subtle differences let you tell these guys apart fairly readily. Now let's jump up or down to the area of Socorro. We also have a gigantic flora from there, probably one of the largest Pennsylvanian floras from the Western US and probably anywhere in the world. I don't want to talk about it in great detail, but for one portion of it. And this is a dune system composed of gypsum and carbonate. Thick, we walked over top of this stuff and just figured, well, it's New Mexico, it's desert, it's dry, you're getting some gypsum on the surface. And then one of our guys discovered, no, this is thick. This is a massive accumulation of gypsum and carbonate. And it turns out to be aeolian dunes. And this guy, John Nelson, took a pause here in one of these ravines, and while standing there, found a tree trunk upright in these dunes. We then began looking around and discovered that there were some really big trees. This is Dan Chaney sitting on one of these trees. You can see its roots coming out. The New Mexico Museum has now extracted this thing. This is the same stump from the side view. This stuff around it is tufa, which is a type of limey deposit. That probably these things were rooted in a lime mud. So imagine a coastal environment with these sand dunes prograding inland over the trees, which were probably growing around a lagoon. Here are a couple of smaller stumps. Here's a modern juniper stump, just to give you some sense of environment for this thing. So we're probably burying these in gypsum. So these are probably growing at a time period between the coal deposits. These would be examples of something growing when the sea was up on the land surface. And we're actually getting a rare look at something in New Mexico that's growing in the most arid times rather than in the wettest times. Here's the anatomy of some of these trunks. Here's one of them here. You can see they have a very large pith. And there is that, oops, there is that large pith. Very dense pycnoxylic wood surrounding it. Here's a longitudinal section. The pith is septate. And so you might think that this thing is a cordite, corditalian. Again, anatomical sections of the pith, but it's not. It's a conifer. And here are longitudinal sections of the wood and cross-section. Longi, you can see the bordered pits, which is typical of coniferous wood. And here are these short rays. Now this is the tangential section. You're looking at the water conducting cells, and these are the ray cells which are projecting through the wood. And this work was done by Howard Falcon Lang, one of our collaborators from the University of London, very fond of M&Ms. So this plant, Howard discovered that the leaf traces in this plant go up to the first ring boundary and stop. So the plant was probably annually deciduous, producing new leaves on small branches each year, and they would be shedding them. So it's a deciduous conifer. And he named it Gibling-odendron after one of his thesis committee members, Martin Gibling. Okay, let's go further south to Beeman Canyon, northeast of Alamogordo. We recently published a monograph on this whole area, the geology and botany. This outcrop was one of our main collecting sites. There it is close up. You can see these are limestone beds with these siltstones in between. Here's one of the excavations in those beds from which we extracted plant fossils. This flora is different from that of Socorro or of Kinney in that it's almost completely composed of seasonally drought-tolerant plants. Here's a typical Walchia pinniformis. This is a very common Paleozoic conifer. You can see its foliage here in sort of a longitudinal view. And while down there, Dan Chaney found this, which looks like conifer foliage. I would have called it, I don't know what kind it was, these long, very stiff leaves. We'd not really seen this kind of conifer foliage before. He found it attached to this. This is a corditalian reproductive organ. So basically, these are basically leaves or bracts, and in those bracts is a small cone-like structure that produces the seeds. So this is a compound organ. And if you imagine a modern pine cone, you may know the Rudolf Fluorine model. If you just took this thing and compressed it down flat into a much more compact cone, you'd have a pine cone. The corditalians have these spread out type cones. So these things in attachment are forming an intermediate, a true intermediate between the cordites and the conifers. And right now, Cindy Loy is working on publishing this. She's at the University of California, Berkeley. There also were seed ferns. You've seen these guys up north further. This is the Mixonura again, a drought-tolerant seed fern, and this is Neurodontopterus auriculata. And we also have something there called Dicranophyllum. This is a type of Dicranophyllum reedi to give you an idea what the leaves look like. This is from Kinney. We didn't find any whole ones like this in Alamogordo, but the leaves were relatively long, thin, and forked. Here's one from Alamogordo. You can see, again, microconchids. We're looking probably at a lagoonal area. Here's a fork in the leaf, and this is probably the base. So we're looking at this part right down here at the base of the leaf. And these plants look like bottle brushes. The Germans have found complete plants. So a plant 2-3 meters high will just have these leaves surrounding the main stem like you see here. So it's a conifer, a strange conifer, one that we don't have a growth form like this today. And we also have native fauna which we encountered down in the desert there. I'm sure you all are familiar with these things. Okay, so let's put all this together. Here's what we think is happening during the Pennsylvanian. Again, it's wet in the mid-continent coal basins in Europe and North America, and it's permanently dry. We have resident drought-tolerant populations out here in the West. This is during a glacial, when the ice has pulled the water off the continent's surface and given us this large expanse. We go into the interglacials, the wetland plants go into refugia, the drought-tolerant plants spread out across the continent. We go back into the next glacial, these guys expand out, reassemble the communities, and then you get back into the next glacial phase. So that's the basic dynamic. That's where how the West feeds these drought-tolerant populations back and forth, while the stuff in the center parts in the coal basins just go in and out of refugia. Really different dynamics for the two. Okay, now the Permian vegetation we'll go through much more quickly because it's much simpler. It tends to be seasonally dry floras, and they tend to be the same. We've published lots of papers on this stuff already, just to give you a sense that there's a lot of literature out there. A look at it, it looks pretty much the same from top to bottom of the state. So here we are down in Doña Ana County. Here's the Abo and Yeso Formation in contact. Here we up in the Zuni Mountains. You can see the red beds up this slope. The equivalent of the Abo Formation, there's my colleague Spencer Lucas pointing at something to do with the red beds. And here we are again up in these are the Robledo Mountains in the southern part of the state. There's Spencer and Scott Elric, who I mentioned to you a moment ago. We're in the equivalent of these red beds. And Larry Reinhardt, now retired from the New Mexico Museum, up in Rio Arriba County. Again, these are fossil soils and then flood type deposits. The red beds are very similar looking throughout their extent. These are the sandstone filled channel, fossil soils, floodplain deposits. Here they are close up. These are big roots penetrating down through the soil. So the water table was low, and these guys had to go down and get it. A typical Abo Formation look, you have the flood horizons, these sheet floods, between which are fossil soils. Here, close up look at one of the sheet floods, lots of stacked flooding intervals, probably short-term floods. You can see a flood horizon, a flood horizon, flood horizon. And in between, you can see some mud cracks on these surfaces, and there's plant debris on the surfaces as well. A close up here, again, multiple flood horizons with plants such as this conifer on those surfaces, and big mud cracked surfaces as well. There also are animals. Think of the floods. The floods come in, they bring in silt. As the flood recedes, muds settle out on the surface. Animals will transgress these muds and leave their footprints. So here's some trackways of some kind of a reptile or another. You can see footprint across this surface, and now you're looking at the underside of these little critters sunk down into the mud, and sand came in and cast them. Conifers of a variety of different types. These are Walchia piniformis, very common form. This is Walchia schneideri. You can see the leaves aren't as tight up against the stem. They're more lax in their architecture. This is Walchia or Lobakia americana, very straight leaves. Again, very, very distinctive looking morphologies. And this is Onovicia hypnoides, or brachyphyllum. We're not sure which one. In this case, the leaves are very closely pressed against the stem. So there's a whole group of conifers that are common in these red bed deposits. They're the dominant form. And maybe a reconstruction like this. This is Mary Parrish did this reconstruction. She was an artist in my department, recently retired, but an excellent artist and has won many awards herself. So a landscape dominated by conifers. Next in importance was a plant called Supaya. Forked fronds. Supaya is something called a peltosperm. This group was very diverse at this time, and we don't have any living examples of it today, but again, distinctive morphology. This was described first by a paleobotanist named David White from the Grand Canyon, and we've since found it all over the Western US. Again, here's a forked frond here, another Supaya frond there, forms these dense mats. Rarely you can see the venation, as up here in the corner, a peltosperm. Now, what does Supaya look like? So you saw the Mary Parrish's reconstruction of the conifers. This is a bedding plain surface where quarrying was going on near Truth or Consequences. And we found this surface and we looked at it. There were animal footprints on it. And there also were plants. These are stems. These are roots emanating out from around these stems. You can see they're between 5 and 10 centimeters in diameter. And it turns out we found Supaya leaves in here. And now these also have been found in the Grand Canyon with Supaya attached. It appears to be a stream-side vegetation, not very big. And here the animal prints were found stepping around these plants. So here are the little footprints going through here of a small reptile. And then this big guy comes along and he actually oversteps himself to not step on one of these Supayas, which were probably stiff and rather prickly, like a lot of modern, like think of Cycas revoluta, the sago palm, probably a lot like that in its construction. So we've got a forest in the background of conifers, and we've got stream sides with these Supayas, and there are a lot of other oddball things. This is Bronyartites, which is actually an invalid name. It's probably Glenopterus, but it's also a peltosperm related to Supaya. This is a weird one. It's Arenifolia anomala. Probably another peltospermous seed fern. There's a Junwang from the Nanjing Institute, Cindy Loy, who I mentioned from Berkeley, Dan Chaney, Spencer, and John Nelson. This is a really weird plant, and we don't have any idea what it actually looks like. This serves as an example of so much paleobotany. We know what the leaves look like, but we don't know what the plants look like to which they were attached. More Supaya anomala from a couple of other places. And this is a more typical, this is Autunia conferta. This is very common in the Permian throughout Europe and the eastern United States, but very rare out here. It's, again, a peltosperm of some kind, again, extinct group of seed plants. And this is something we found recently from the Yeso Formation. This is Autunia naumannii. So these are among the youngest plant fossils of the Paleozoic known in New Mexico, another peltosperm. These guys were collected in the 1930s from the Zuni Mountains. This is Teniopterus. It appears to be an early cycad. Serge Mamet has published on this. These are attached to stems. So if you can follow these through the rock, and it's very unusual to find the leaves in attachment. And finally, Sphenophyllum, a little plant which I mentioned, you may remember in that reconstruction down in that valley bottom, there were little plants growing. This is Sphenophyllum gilmorei. And the stems would have been here with their whorl of leaves around them. It's a sphenopsid of a group that was in parallel with the Calamitales. So also very high water conductance vascular systems. So that's the red bed plants. And I thought how to bring this to an end. These are raindrop imprints. So imagine these red beds consist of a series of floods. They come in, bring in this water over these big sheet floods. Okay, the water begins to recede, and the final phases of it, you get some imprints of the final raindrops on the surface of that mud. And then the sun comes back out. This is modern mud cracks. Here's some fossil. It cracks the mud, and everything gets sunny again. A good lesson for life. So that is it, and I thank you very much. I guess I could sum up by saying that what's the point of all this? I mean, we collect fossil plants, and what are we trying to learn from this? We're really after ecosystem dynamics. Remember, again, we're in a low diversity world. How does that world work? Does it work differently from today? Can we take modern concepts of ecology or evolutionary biology and see them at work in the Paleozoic? All the plants are different, but we're in a world with similar glacial, interglacial dynamics. So it gives us a laboratory where we can ask a lot of questions about how these ecosystems operate, how they reassemble after being disrupted, how robust they are to various kinds of disturbances. So we can really study it here in the past and see to what extent they're similar or different from our modern systems. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bill. That was fascinating. I'm going to be looking a lot more closely at especially red beds when I pass by them. I had a question for you, and anyone who has questions, you can either put them in the chat or you can unmute yourself to ask a question. I was wondering about, it seemed as though a lot of the plants you talked about were growing in brackish water, and did they have, or can you tell if they had adaptations to high salt levels?
That's a good question, because we're finding them in environments, fossil environments or ancient environments that give evidence of brackish water. They probably didn't grow there. Most of them probably are transported into those environments. And imagine it's very hard to preserve organic matter in a terrestrial environment. The bugs will eat it right away. So 99.9 far out of all the organic matter that falls on the surface is immediately destroyed. Even in a peat swamp, there's studies on, if you're in a big peat forming swamp, most of the litter that falls down never makes it into the peat. More than 2/3 of it disappears before it ever gets down into the under the water table of the peat forming environment. So on the land surface, the plants literally have to fall into some kind of standing water setting to have a chance of being preserved. So these are probably falling in, being transported out into wetland settings and then being buried. So that's really what's doing.
Okay. Anyone have questions that you want to unmute yourself to ask? Let's see. I was also struck at how similar the seed fern leaves look to sort of modern ferns, even though modern ferns aren't seed ferns, but how different a lot of the trees looked, except for the conifers, I guess.
Yeah, that's an interesting point too. And I think one of the things about the construction of the wetland forest, a question that gets asked repeatedly is, why are there so many compound leaves? Not just in the seed ferns, but you have the tree ferns with compound leaves. A lot of the small plants, which I didn't show you, have compound leaves. What is it about that? Is there something about the environment that lends itself to greater survival of these plants? A lot of things that we don't have answers for. They just haven't been pursued. A lot of the work in paleobotany has been the description of the species rather than looking at questions about their ecology. And a lot of the younger people that are coming up now are asking those kinds of questions. They're building on what's known. So we may get some answers to that at some point. It may have to do with surface area, water transport capacity. Those medulosins, by the way, one of my colleagues, the seed ferns, a guy named Jonathan Wilson, he's at Haverford College. He studies the actual mathematical physiology of water transport. And he was looking at medulosin tracheids, the water transport cells, versus conifer tracheids. And he has a slide he shows. The conifer tracheid in the slide, think of the size of an old-fashioned wood pencil, and next to it a 50-gallon oil drum. The medulosin trachea is like a 50-gallon oil drum. It's gigantic compared to other things. So they would have been very, very sensitive to drought because the tracheas are so big, they would have collapsed if they ever lost water retention. So those plants could really move water. And the question is, where would it go? So you would have these big fronds with lots of stomata on them to pump all that water out. So yeah, you have some real plants really capable of moving water in these swamps.
questions from anyone else?
Yeah, hi, I had a quick question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, go
Oh,
ahead.
hi. Yeah, there was an article last week in Science that was, I guess, announcing a discovery, at least in a marine assemblage, of a diverse set of fossils. I can't remember from the era, I'm sorry. It's like, maybe it was the Permian or maybe earlier. And at least the way it was promoted in Science, I think the editors were calling it Extinction Rebellion, and it was challenging this notion, or I guess the consensus of the community, that the species assemblages were quite diverse, and sorry, were not as diverse in the past as in the present. And if you had seen that article, I was just wondering if you had any comments about that. But if you're not, that's fine as well. And thank you for the very nice talk.
Well, thank you. No, I haven't seen the article, and they were saying they're challenging the low diversity of the past assemblages. Is that what they're saying? They're
Yeah,
actually.
that's correct. In a marine assemblage.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. There's I had a discussion with a colleague of mine, a guy named Walton Green, and was saying that, I think our assemblages are so low diversity. And a colleague of mine, Scott Wing, and I, we did a comparative analysis. Scott came in my office one day and said, "How many species do you find if you dig a hole in the ground, square meter, let's say?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, maybe 10, up to 15, sometimes 20, but not usually." And I said, "Well, how many do you find?" So that's the same. What happens if you go laterally on a bed and dig 50 holes? How many species do you find? I said, "Well, 25 or 30. How many do you find?" 200. So it's a completely different sampling world in the Cretaceous where he was working compared to me working in the Pennsylvanian. So I think we're actually in a lower diversity world. Now, I was talking to Walton Green about this, and he thinks I'm absolutely incorrect. He says that evolution should fill up the space. You can't have a world with that low of a diversity. Evolution would create new species to utilize the underutilized resources. So it's a really interesting argument. And one, I actually had one of my graduate students who's recently finished, Rebecca Cole, worked on a Permian flora from a site called the Emily Irish Grant in Texas. Serge Meme collected that site with a bulldozer in 1959 and 1960. We have 20 fossil cabinets full of fossils. I think the total number of specimens she examined was close to 10,000, something like that. And we should, if you're in a modern environment, if you look what's called a dominance diversity curve, you have some measure of importance, and then you rank those importances from most to least. You should have a curve that goes down and has a long tail of n=1. You found that thing one time. And if you go into the modern tropics, one of our now deceased curators, Terry Irwin, used to spray trees with insecticide, and all these insects would drop down, and he'd catch them on big nets. And they had they would find they found a beetle, and they knew n=1. They never found another one. You might find a male, they never found a female. Where are the rest of the population? They were getting all these rare things, huge numbers of rare things. We don't find them. Rebecca did not find a large number of n=1s, despite having this big sample. So it's really a problem for us. We don't know if we're overlumping, which is a possibility. We can't really test these things, so we could be missing subtle variations that in modern species would turn out genetically to be different species. So there's a lot that we can't do because we're stuck with only morphology. So diversity questions are real important that people are still struggling with. Marine and
we have a question in the chat. In the Abo Formation, you pointed out beds of rock marking flood phases. What you call floods must have been long-term events to form such thick layers. Is that a misunderstanding? And do you mean seawater inundations or freshwater flooding?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because it really does come down to aspects of sedimentology, how you interpret the environments, which are really critical for us. If you're working in a terrestrial environment, you must also be sort of a wannabe sedimentologist trying to understand the environment. And so I would say that most of those floods are short-term, high-intensity, high sediment transport floods. They look like they're what are called sheet floods, big unconstrained flooding that covers large areas of the landscape, probably really intense and overbank, carrying a lot of mud with them. And you can look at the internal bedding in these silt deposits. They're really not sand for the most part. They're mostly silt stones. And they don't have a lot of internal lamination. They're fairly massive. The beds are thick. So this stuff is coming in a hurry. And you can often tell that from plant fossils that cross bedding surfaces. So if you find a plant fossil going sideways across multiple beds, it means that stuff came in a hurry. And so you'll see that. And then you'll see these mud layers on top. So the siltstones might be anywhere from 10 to 20 centimeters thick and maybe have 2 or 3 layers in them. And then you'll have a thin bed of mud, what's called a mud drape. So the flooding subsides, the fine material settles out on top of the slightly coarser material. And one of my favorite things is to give his presents whenever I find them to my friends who are sort of suffering, is that you find a block of siltstone, there's the flood. You find a bed with raindrops imprint on it and then mud cracks. And it's like the sun always comes back out. You know, the flood stops, the mud drops, the raindrops stop falling, and the sun comes out and cracks it open. I mean, it happened in the Paleozoic just like it happens today. So you're probably dealing with a really intensely monsoonal kind of environment. You're transporting lots of sediment, and you're not transporting anything for some seasonal period of time.
Well, that might be a good place to end with the sun coming back out and drying up the mud. Unless, are there any other questions? Well, Bill, thanks again for being so flexible with your talk and taking the time to speak with us on your trip out here. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks to you all for listening to me. And I really, like I say, I appreciate the chance to just have been forced to go back through 1,000 New Mexico photographs. It was a lot of fun for me too.